Um, and I'm accustomed batting fairly high in the order. So it's indeed a pleasure. Good night to you. Topic is really a look at issues of recession, whether or not as a country have made mistakes, whether we've learned any lessons, and the way forward. Well, Barbados has a history of inheriting three very important things from the British. The Westminster style of parliamentary democracy, notions that we are entitled to have property rights, and a legal system that is still considered to be a major reason why we have made, along with the two others, such advances for the last couple of centuries. The thing here is that the Barbados economy itself is small, which means that physically we are small. It is open, which means that we do a lot of trade with the rest of the world. And most importantly, it is very vulnerable. So inasmuch as Barbados is considered to be a good example of economic management in the region, Barbados is still, to my mind, one of the most vulnerable economies in the Caribbean. And that has to be taken into consideration. In order to look at this topic tonight, there are three agents which I would also seek to classify the economy into: the government, the private sector, and households. In terms of a recession is officially 2 consecutive quarters of economic decline. That is what we may call negative growth. Barbados, since its independence, has effectively experienced recessions on about 4 occasions, but there are 3 major occasions: 1973 oil crisis, the 1981 to 82 period when we had an international recession as well, but that period was characterized by very high interest rates. In fact, it was not uncommon for interest rates to be in excess of 12 or 15% in terms of lending rates. And then the period of 1991 to 92. It is my contention that the current recession which we're in differs from the other 2 major recessions that we've had in this regard. One, that the unemployment rate in Barbados around 1991-93 averaged 21% and reached a high of about 24%. The unemployment rate in the early 1980s recession was average around 15%. But as I speak to you, Barbados' unemployment rate is now approaching, or has been around 10% over the last 2 years. The other thing is that the reserves, which is an important indicator of the economic health of Barbados, those reserves were extremely low in the early 1990s. In fact, at one stage, when I was at the central bank, which the public would not know, we had minus reserves during the day of October. Now, as I speak to you, Barbados' reserves are not that low. In fact, there has been a lot of boast about the coverage, 20 weeks coverage of imports. That is approximately true. So what makes this recession different? Since we're not experiencing high inflation, which we did in the early 1980s, we're not experiencing as high an inflation as we did in the early 1990s when inflation was moderately high at around 6%. Inflation is now tracking at about 3 to 4%. This is why I think that we are mischaracterizing this current recession. And let me demonstrate that. In Barbados, based on 40 years of economic management, there are some best practices that we can look at. And the first best practice is this, that all the social democratic parties in the region, which would have inherited their political philosophy predominantly from the British, determined that they had to run surpluses on government's current account. That is, that good management starts with government ensuring that it has savings on its current account. To explain that simply means that the collection of revenue in any given year exceeds the payment of 4 categories of current expenditure of government. Those 4 categories are wages and salaries, interest payment on debt, goods and services bought for institutions, and transfers and subsidies to schools, NHC, NCF, University of the West Indies, Barbados Water Authority, the Barbados Transport Board. But best practice dictated that in a socialist sense, we extracted more from our revenue than we paid in terms of current expenditure which we incurred in any given year, and that the excess would go towards the building of capital projects along with borrowing. Now, to my mind, what has really happened is that we are in a recession where we're very uncertain about the rate at which we will recover. Previously, the government would simply adjust its spending and its overall deficits, and in doing so, ask households and the private sector to assist them in correcting the balance of payments difficulties which we would have experienced in the 2 previous recessions. We do not have the kind of balance of payments difficulties which we had in those 2 previous recessions in the 80s and the 1990s.